14th, 2015 began with the sky already hazy over Alberta's thick forests, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and burning pine. Carlos, a seasoned wildfire firefighter with over a decade of fieldwork, had been part of countless dangerous operations before, but this one carried a different weight. The blaze had spread quickly overnight, forcing his crew to push deep toward the fire's edge to cut away dense brush and create a break that could slow the advancing flames. He was known among his peers for his sharp instincts, calm demeanor under pressure, and unmatched stamina during long shifts. Raised in a small rural town near the Rockies, Carlos had grown up hunting, fishing, and learning how to read the forest signs from his grandfather. That upbringing gave him a respect for wildlife, but also an understanding that wild animals could act unpredictably under stress, especially in disasters. The sun was barely visible through the thick orange haze when Carlos moved to a section of overgrown underbrush separated from the main crew. The ground was uneven, the heat pressing down in waves, and the distant roar of the fire grew louder as wind carried it toward them. His hands worked quickly, swinging his Pulaski tool to clear low branches and tangled shrubs, each strike blending into the rhythmic noise of nearby chainsaws and crackling flames. Despite the chaos, he remained focused, his eyes scanning both the terrain and the shifting wall of smoke ahead. Then, in an instant, the forest's sounds changed. The normal distant noise of fire and falling trees gave way to a deep, guttural rumble that froze him mid-step. Through the shifting smoke, a massive shape emerged, dark, broad, and moving with a deliberate force. A large female grizzly stepped into view, her coat thick with dust and ash, her head lowered toward him. Two cubs trailed behind her, their small bodies tense as they stayed close to her side. Before Carlos could retreat, the bear's posture shifted. Her ears flattened, her front paw struck the ground, and with a surge of raw power, she lunged forward. Carlos dropped his tool instantly, heart pounding, and turned toward the nearest escape, a steep embankment that led to higher ground. The rough slope was scattered with loose dirt and protruding roots, each step a battle against slipping back down. Halfway up, his boot caught against a buried branch, sending him tumbling forward. Sharp rocks tore into his arm, leaving streaks of blood down his sleeve. He scrambled upright and pushed forward again, only to stumble a second time, his legs straining to keep pace ahead of the thundering movement behind him. The bear closed the gap quickly, her growls cutting through the smoke and ash-filled air. Carlos reached for the one lifeline still within his grasp, the air horn clipped to his belt. Without hesitation, he turned, raising it toward the massive figure now just a few strides away. His finger tightened on the trigger, unleashing a deafening blast that pierced the chaos of the fire and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The blaring horn shattered the tense air, echoing sharply across the smoky hillside. The grizzly flinched, halting mid-stride, her head lifting slightly as the piercing sound cut through her instinct to attack. For a moment, Carlos could see the wild confusion in her eyes, torn between protecting her cubs and retreating from the sudden noise. Ash swirled around them as the fire's heat pulsed in steady waves, and the ground trembled faintly from distant collapsing trees. The bear's hesitation gave Carlos the precious seconds he needed. He took a step backward, keeping his body turned toward her so she could see him moving away without triggering another charge. The cubs shifted nervously behind her, and with one final huff, she lowered her head, pivoted toward the thicker brush, and melted back into the forest shadows. Carlos stood frozen for a heartbeat, chest heaving, before finally forcing his legs to move. His arms and legs burned from scrapes, and sweat mingled with the smoke on his skin. The embankment ahead looked endless, but he climbed steadily, driven by the need to regroup with his team. Every rustle in the brush sent his pulse racing, but the only sounds now were the distant pop of burning timber and the crackle of dry branches underfoot. When he finally reached a small ridge, the faint outlines of his crew came into view through the smoky veil. Relief swept through him like a cold wind after a long climb. The others noticed his battered state immediately. Though shaken, Carlos quickly signaled for them to keep working while he caught his breath. They had a fire line to maintain, and every minute counted. Still, word of his encounter spread fast among the firefighters. The knowledge that a grizzly and her cubs were now roaming close to the active fire zone added another layer of risk to an already dangerous job. Throughout the afternoon, Carlos remained close to the central crew, helping direct brush clearing and keeping an ear tuned for any unusual sounds. The adrenaline from the encounter slowly faded, replaced by a deep fatigue that made his hands tremble when he stopped moving. His cuts stung each time sweat trickled over them, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing on the task ahead. By evening, the fire's spread had slowed in their section, thanks to the combined efforts of the teams. When helicopters finally arrived with water drops, Carlos felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. As they retreated from the active line for the night, the image of the bear's sudden appearance replayed in his mind. He knew the wildfire had likely driven her into unfamiliar territory, making her more defensive and unpredictable. Back at the temporary camp, medics cleaned and dressed his wounds, noting how lucky he was to have avoided worse injuries. Around the firebreak that night, the crew spoke quietly about the day's events. The story of his narrow escape served as a sober reminder that in the wild, danger can come from more than just flames. The next morning, Carlos was back on the line, fully aware that the forest and its inhabitants were watching every move. The early morning mist hovered low over the tundra on October 14th, 2015, blanketing the remote Russian airstrip in thick gray fog that blurred the skeletal outlines of birch and pine. 42-year-old Yuri Pavlenko, a seasoned aircraft mechanic with over 15 years of experience working in harsh conditions, made his rounds before dawn. The tundra airstrip was a lifeline for the isolated community, a strip of gravel and ice where supply planes landed irregularly, and every worker depended on careful maintenance and vigilance. Yuri was stocky and tough, his hands calloused from years of turning wrenches on engines and refueling aircraft in sub-zero weather. That morning, he was inspecting the fuel storage shed, a small, weather-beaten structure near the tree line. The rising sun had yet to pierce the fog, and the air smelled cold and sharp, filled with the faint scent of kerosene mixed with earth and decay. Nearby, Victor, a 22-year-old junior technician, had arrived early to assist with equipment checks. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he stepped toward the fuel shed, radio in hand. Suddenly, movement caught his eye, a massive shadow materializing from the mist near the edge of the tree line. It was a Russian grizzly bear. The bear moved with silent menace, its massive bulk barely making a sound as it emerged through the fog. Its fur was matted with frost and dirt, and its dark eyes gleamed with a fierce intelligence. Victor's heart pounded as he realized the bear was likely drawn by food waste, carelessly discarded behind the storage containers. A dangerous mistake in this wild place. Victor called out a warning to Yuri, but it was too late. Yuri hadn't seen the bear until it was mere yards away. The grizzly charged with terrifying speed, its heavy paws pounding the frozen ground like thunder. The impact struck Yuri with brutal force, sending him crashing sideways into the cold metal side of the fuel shed. Pain exploded through his body as the bear's massive jaws sank into his flesh, tearing at muscle and bone with savage efficiency. Victor reacted instantly, grabbing a flare gun from his belt and firing into the air. His voice shook as he radioed for help, calling for backup from the main base station miles away. But the bear was relentless. It dragged Yuri's body behind a snowbank berm, partially burying him in the icy snow as it continued its savage attack. Minutes stretched like hours in the cold dawn silence. When reinforcements finally arrived, armed rangers and fellow technicians, the scene was grim. The bear still loomed nearby, its fur dusted with blood, standing guard over its kill. The team fired warning shots, the sharp cracks echoing across the tundra. The bear growled but retreated briefly into the fog. The site was immediately locked down, and the airstrip operations were suspended as a full investigation was launched. Later that night, the grizzly returned under the cover of darkness, confirming the animal's predatory intent. It was tracked over the following days using GPS collars and blood trails. Authorities made the difficult decision to euthanize the bear, ending a terrifying chapter in the airstrip's history. The attack marked one of the deadliest bear incidents recorded at an operational aviation post in the Russian tundra. It sent shockwaves through the remote community, highlighting the fatal consequences of neglecting proper food disposal in bear country. For Victor and the others who witnessed the attack, the memory remained vivid. The cold fog, the silent approach of the massive predator, the thunderous impact that shattered the quiet morning. The wilderness was unforgiving, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Yuri Pavlenko's death was mourned deeply, a stark reminder of nature's power lurking just beyond the edge of human settlement, waiting to strike when least expected. On August 3, 2009, thick smoke rolled across the wild hills of Alberta as flames crept closer to the dense forest. Carlos, a seasoned firefighter with more than a decade of experience, was working near the fire's edge. Over the years, he had faced everything from small grass fires to massive blazes, earning a reputation among his crew for endurance and quick thinking. Growing up in a rural community surrounded by forest, he'd learned early how unpredictable nature could be. This wildfire had already consumed hundreds of acres, and that day's assignment placed him in a high-risk zone, cutting back heavy brush to slow the flames' advance. The heat was relentless, pressing against him like a physical weight, and the air carried the acrid sting of burning wood. Ash drifted down like snow, clinging to his gear and settling into the folds of his gloves. The constant roar of the flames was a deep, steady backdrop as he worked. His boots sank into uneven ground, and each swing of his tool sent leaves and twigs scattering. Visibility was poor. Smoke drifted thick between tree trunks, and the dense undergrowth made every step deliberate. Still, Carlos moved steadily, knowing every section cleared could help slow the fire's spread before a sudden shift in wind. Then, something in the haze moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker in the shifting smoke. But as the wind pushed the haze aside, the shape resolved into a massive grizzly not 20 feet away. Her head was low, her muscles tense, and two small cubs clung close to her side, their pale fur stark against the scorched earth. The mother's dark eyes locked on him, and her body lowered further in a silent warning. Carlos realized instantly what had happened. He had stumbled into her path, and with the fire closing in, she had no escape. The deep rumble of her growl cut through the sound of burning trees, low and threatening. In the next heartbeat, she lunged, the ground trembling under her charge. Adrenaline surged. He dropped his tool and turned toward the steep slope ahead. The embankment was littered with loose soil and sharp rocks, but it was the only chance to put distance between them. Boots digging in, he sprinted downhill, heart hammering in his chest. Halfway down, his foot caught on a root buried under ash. He pitched forward, hitting hard on his side. Pain flared along his forearm where skin tore against jagged stone. He scrambled up, but the slope was treacherous. A tangle of branches caught his boot, sending him stumbling again. Scratches burned along his legs and arms, mixing with the heat already pressing in on him. The sound of pursuit didn't falter. Heavy paws crushed debris, and her sharp, quick breaths grew louder. Smoke curled between them, but Carlos could still glimpse her moving through the haze, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Pushing past exhaustion, he forced himself onward. The slope leveled into a small clearing, the ground here flat but cluttered with fallen logs and loose debris. He steadied himself enough to grab the one thing still at his belt, his air horn. As the bear closed the final stretch, Carlos swung the device up and pressed it hard. A burst of piercing sound exploded into the air, cutting through the roar of the fire and the thick blanket of smoke. The sudden, unnatural noise made her stop short, head jerking back as her ears flattened. For a moment, they stared at each other through the shifting haze, her breathing deep and deliberate. Carlos hit the horn again, longer, louder. She blinked, took a slow step back, and her cubs pressed tight against her legs. With a final growl, she turned toward the darker edge of the forest, leading the cubs away from the flames. Only when she disappeared from sight did Carlos lower the horn. His arms trembled from both adrenaline and exertion, his chest heaving in sharp bursts. Blood trickled from his forearm into his glove, and his uniform was scuffed, carrying the mixed scent of smoke, sweat, and torn earth. He bent to retrieve his dropped tools and began the climb back towards safer ground where the rest of his crew worked. The wildfire's edge was closer now, orange light flickering through thick smoke as embers rained down in short bursts. Other firefighters turned to look as he approached, eyes catching on his torn gear and bleeding arm. No one needed to ask what had happened. Command was alerted immediately. Nearby crews were pulled back from that sector to avoid more encounters with wildlife displaced by the fire. Wildlife officers along the perimeter were warned, ready to deal with animals moving unpredictably in the shifting chaos. Carlos received treatment on the line. Cool water rinsed away grit from his scrapes before fresh bandages were wrapped around his arm. The medic worked quickly, but Carlos knew the marks from the rough ground would stay for weeks. Even as his wounds were cleaned, the scene replayed in his head. The bear's sudden lunge, the closeness of her breath, the raw force of her presence. By nightfall, the fire still burned, the smell of charred wood heavy in the air. The crew gathered for a briefing, and word of Carlos's encounter passed through camp in low tones. Some nodded grimly, knowing wildfires often drove animals into sudden, dangerous contact with people. Others glanced toward the dark tree line, reminded that the balance between human and wild could shift without warning. For Carlos, the day's events settled into memory, a sharp reminder that survival in these places depended on readiness, instinct, and a deep respect for the forces, both flame and flesh, that shape the wilderness. On June 4th, 2022, the road cut through endless forest like a scar, narrow, uneven, winding deep into the eastern Siberian wilderness. Frost clung to the edges of tree trunks even in early autumn, and the dirt path, churned by heavy equipment, was slick with mud and early ice. Ivan, 51, and his younger co-worker Grigory, 33, were headed back from a week-long timber job near the upper reaches of the Uda River. Their flatbed Ural truck was loaded lightly, but its rear axle had taken a hard hit on a boulder just an hour before. Now it groaned with every turn, the metal screeching against itself, barely holding. The forest around them was thick, shadowed even in daylight, and the truck's radio had gone dead that morning. No signal this deep, not for miles. Their progress was slow. Branches scraped the windshield, and engine noise echoed hollowly through the trees. Around a bend in the road, just past a slope where runoff carved gullies into the clay, the truck's headlights picked up something in the center of the path. It was motionless at first. A shape hunched over a dark form in the road, fur matted, haunches flexing. A grizzly, massive, easily over 800 pounds, its coat thick and reddish-brown, streaked with black mud and old blood. The animal stood over the carcass of a half-eaten bull elk, ribs exposed and steaming in the cold air. One antler lay snapped beneath a foreleg. The bear glanced up slowly as the truck rolled to a stop 30 meters away, its dark eyes catching the low light. Ivan killed the engine. The ticking of hot metal cooling was the only sound for a few seconds. Grigory gripped the dash, unmoving. The bear didn't bolt. It didn't flinch. It simply stared, then returned to feeding, muscles rippling as it tore through sinew and flesh. They waited. Minutes passed. Nothing changed. The bear stayed in the middle of the road, unmoved by the presence of the truck. Its body blocked the path, and with the broken axle, reversing and taking the old logging detour would be nearly impossible. Ivan reached behind the seat and pulled out his hunting rifle. The bore was clean. The safety clicked off. Grigory opened his door quietly, stepping onto the gravel with his boots crunching faintly. Ivan followed, lifting the rifle to fire a warning shot into the air. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. A dull click echoed in the trees. The rifle had jammed. The bear lifted its head, eyes wide and fixed. A beat passed. Then it charged. The movement was sudden, brutally fast. The distance between them vanished in seconds. Ivan stepped back, slipped on the damp gravel, and hit the ground hard. The bear's paw swung wide, claws raking across his scalp, and the force of it slammed his head into the dirt. Pain shot through his jaw and down his neck, vision going white for a heartbeat as blood ran into his eyes. Grigory didn't think. He grabbed a wrench from the truck bed, a heavy steel one they used on axle bolts, and hurled it at the blur of muscle barreling into his friend. The tool struck the bear's side with a loud, wet thud. The animal spun, rearing onto its hind legs, teeth bared, chest rising like a wall in front of them. For a moment, time held still. Grigory stood frozen beside the truck, his hand still half raised. Ivan groaned on the ground, blood spreading beneath his head. The bear stayed upright, breathing hard, eyes locked on both men. But it didn't charge again. It dropped down onto all fours, backed slowly toward the elk, never turning its back. Then, with one final glance, it gripped the elk carcass in its jaws and dragged it off the road, bones scraping across rock and frozen ground. Silence followed. Neither man spoke. Even lay still, his hand pressed against his torn scalp, blood leaking between his fingers. His jaw ached badly, but he could move it. He blinked up at the canopy above, trying to focus. Grigory knelt beside him, eyes wide, hands trembling. No words passed between them, only breath, fogging into the cold air. They got Ivan to his feet, swaying, one arm over Grigory's shoulder. He stayed conscious, though blood dripped steadily down his neck and soaked into the collar of his coat. Back in the truck, Grigory drove, coaxing the vehicle forward despite the grinding protest of the broken axle. The metal screamed at every turn, but the wheels held. 4 hours they drove. Neither man spoke. The road was long, and the forest seemed darker than before, with branches that seemed denser, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The truck swayed and groaned and jerked across frost-heaved ruts, and all the while Ivan stared forward, hand pressed to his scalp, lips tight. When they finally reached a satellite tower and were able to radio for help, they were pale, drained, and numb. Ivan was flown to a hospital in Khabarovsk, where they stitched his scalp with 37 sutures and diagnosed him with a minor skull fracture and permanent hearing loss in one ear. The scar stretched across his scalp like a jagged line of lightning, always visible beneath his thinning hair. But the part he remembered most was not the pain, not the blood or the silence in his ear. It was the bear's eyes. He told Grigory later, when they met again weeks after, that what he saw wasn't fury. It wasn't madness or fear. It was certain. That bear hadn't hesitated. It had charged because it knew exactly what it was willing to do to protect what it had. The elk was its meal. The road was its ground, and the men were just pieces of motion that didn't matter. It had looked at them the way a predator looks at anything in its path, not with emotion, but with intent. And that was what stayed with them both. The Arctic night wrapped the remote Norwegian wilderness in a vast frozen silence on March 12, 2022. Far above the fjords, perched high on a ridgeline well within the Arctic Circle, the ski lodge lay surrounded by endless fields of snow and ice. The air was bitterly cold, yet unusually mild for early March. Temperatures hovered just below freezing, a delicate balance that kept the snow heavy and damp rather than brittle. A weak moon cast pale light on the jagged mountain peaks, while stars twinkled dimly through thin veils of drifting cloud. The stillness was nearly absolute, broken only by the faint hiss of restless wind scouring over the frozen ridges and the distant cracking of shifting ice far below. At the edge of this frozen kingdom, 2 maintenance workers, Eric and Lars, were driving the lodge's snowcat in the depths of a long night shift. Their task was to clear the upper ski trails of heavy snow drifts that threatened to bury markers and make passage impossible by morning. Inside the cab of the machine, warmed by its engine and insulated from the Arctic chill by thick glass and steel, Eric focused on guiding the tracks over the rugged, uneven terrain. Outside, Lars moved carefully, stepping off the vehicle from time to time to check buried trail markers and ensure the path remained clear and visible. The snowcat was a machine built for these extremes, massive, tracked, and armored with a heavy front blade designed to push through deep snow and ice. It rumbled like a low beast, its engine's steady growl the only sound other than the crunch of snow beneath its wide tracks. Around 2:40 a.m., as Lars knelt beside a half-buried marker near an exposed ridgeline, the wind tugged sharply at his parka hood, carrying with it an eerie stillness that prickled his skin. The air was heavy with the scent of frost and ice, but something else hung faintly on the breeze, an unfamiliar presence. His gaze lifted to the ridgeline above, where suddenly, a large white figure emerged from the shadows. The massive silhouette moved slowly, pacing with deliberate steps that left deep impressions in the powdery snow. It was enormous, its thick fur blending almost seamlessly with the snowy terrain, a ghostly apparition stalking silently beneath the pale light. A polar bear. The beast's powerful frame was silhouetted against the night sky, its dark eyes glowing faintly as it fixed its gaze on the small glowing cab of the snowcat and the lone figure below. For nearly 15 minutes, the bear watched silently, motionless, except for the slow rhythm of its breath steaming in the cold air. Its gaze was both patient and calculating, as if measuring the strange, noisy creatures and the peculiar roaring machine. Inside the cab, Eric noticed Lars's tense posture and followed his gaze, spotting the bear silhouetted high on the ridge. The workers exchanged grim looks, knowing that such close encounters were rare but dangerous, especially at this time of year, when sea ice had melted earlier than usual, forcing polar bears to move inland in search of food. Before they could react further, the bear made its decision. It shifted its massive weight and lunged into motion. The ground beneath the beast was treacherous, slick with ice and loose snow, and the bear slipped twice as it charged downhill, its powerful legs flailing briefly before regaining balance. Then it was a blur of white fury, racing toward the snowcat at terrifying speed. At that instant, Lars was crouched too far from the cab, inspecting the buried marker. His heart thudded violently as adrenaline surged through his veins. He scrambled to his feet, muscles aching and cold, threatening to numb his limbs, and bolted toward the snowcat, breath ragged in the thin Arctic air. The bear closed the gap fast. The crunch of snow and ice beneath massive paws filled the night, closing in like thunder on the wind. Lars barely made it to the safety of the cab's open door when the bear slammed into the snowcat's heavy front blade with a force that sent the entire vehicle rocking. The metal groaned under the impact, shaking violently as the machine resisted the force of the blow. The windows rattled sharply, snow sprayed up in a white cloud, but the snowcat remained firmly grounded, a fortress built to withstand the Arctic's fiercest assaults. The polar bear circled the snowcat twice, low growls rumbling from its throat like ice cracking beneath enormous weight. Its sharp claws scraped against the steel, leaving faint marks in the snow as it paced, tense and watchful. The two men inside sat motionless, the cold sweat of fear slick on their skin beneath layers of protective clothing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear stepped back, retreating silently into the shadows beyond the ridge, melting into the Arctic night like a ghost. The lodge's management quickly shut down all upper trails for 72 hours, prioritizing safety as wildlife officers deployed to monitor the region. The two workers emerged physically unharmed but profoundly shaken by the encounter. The presence of a hungry polar bear so close to human activity was a stark reminder of the changing Arctic. Thermal camera footage retrieved from the snowcat's exterior sensors captured the bear's patient vigil. The grainy black and white images showed the massive white figure pacing along the ridge for nearly 15 minutes before the sudden charge. The footage documented the bear's precise movements, its tense posturing, and the fierce collision with the snowcat's blade. However, this footage was never released to the public or media. Officials deemed its release too alarming, fearing it might provoke panic or interfere with ongoing conservation efforts. They chose instead to keep the footage confidential, a silent record of nature's raw power and the uneasy coexistence between man and beast in a rapidly changing world. Scientists attributed the bear's unusual behavior to the early thinning and breakup of Arctic sea ice, a direct consequence of rising global temperatures. As hunting grounds disappear, polar bears are forced to move inland, sometimes coming perilously close to human settlements and infrastructure. This encounter was part of a growing pattern, a symptom of environmental shifts reshaping the fragile balance of life in the high north. For Eric and Lars, the night's events etched deep impressions that would not fade. The Arctic was no longer a distant wilderness viewed through the lens of adventure and industry. It was an active, living force, unpredictable and unforgiving. The ghostly monarch of the Arctic had reminded them of its dominion with a fury as white and cold as the endless snowfields. The echo of that collision, the rocking of the snowcat, the ghostly silhouette pacing in the moonlight, they remained with them like a warning. Respect, vigilance, and humility were the only shields against the wilderness's unforgiving power. On March 3, 2017, the icy horizon near Greenland's edge glowed with soft morning light, the kind that made every snowflake glisten. Mia, an experienced wildlife photographer in her early 30s, had traveled from her home in Norway to document the Arctic's most elusive creatures. Years of work in cold, remote places had made her patient and precise. She had learned to remain still for hours in freezing temperatures, waiting for the perfect moment when an animal's movement told a story no words could. This trip had been planned for months, timed to coincide with the late winter season when polar bears could often be spotted near the ice edge hunting for seals. Mia's small inflatable boat drifted gently in the calm water, each paddle stroke barely disturbing the glassy surface. Layers of insulated clothing wrapped around her, and a thick hat shielded her ears from the cutting wind. Her camera hung from a strap across her chest, its lens pointed toward a distant cluster of ice floes. In her pack, she carried emergency gear, flares, and a satellite phone. Knowing how quickly the Arctic could change from serene to dangerous, the early hours had been quiet, filled only with the sound of the boat's gentle creak and the distant call of seabirds. Then a movement on a nearby floe caught her eye. A small polar bear cub, its fur bright against the white ice, stood alone, looking toward her with unblinking curiosity. The gap of water between them was narrow, the ice shifting gently with the current. The cub's ears twitched as it tilted its head, then it stepped forward. Without hesitation, it slid into the frigid water, paddling with surprising speed toward the boat. Mia stayed still, her gloved hands resting lightly on the paddle. The cub's small head broke the surface again and again until it reached the side of the inflatable. With a quick heave of its front paws, it clambered aboard, its wet fur dripping onto the rubber floor. The animal's weight made the boat dip slightly to one side, and Mia shifted her balance to stay steady. The cub's movements were clumsy, but playful, its paws pressing into the boat's surface. Then came the faint sound, an air hiss, quiet but unmistakable. The cub's sharp claws had punctured the side of the inflatable, creating a slow leak. Mia's gaze flicked to the spot where the air was escaping, a small bubble forming in the smooth rubber. Her heart rate quickened, but she kept her body calm, knowing any sudden motion might startle the animal. From the corner of her vision, another shape emerged on the water. Larger, faster, and moving with purpose, the mother bear was closing in. Her head was low, eyes locked on the boat, and each powerful stroke brought her closer. The cub turned toward the sound of the splashes, and the stillness in the air vanished as the mother's deep growl rolled across the water. The cub froze at the sound, its small frame pressed close to the boat's floor. The larger figure moved swiftly through the icy water, each surge leaving a ripple that spread wide across the calm surface. The mother's massive shoulders broke the waves, sending drops flying into the air. Her breath came in sharp bursts, steam rising from her muzzle in the cold morning light. The distance between her and the inflatable shrank with alarming speed, the water churning in her wake. Mia's eyes stayed on the advancing shape, her body tense but steady. She reached for the flare gun secured to her side, fingers working through the thick gloves. The cub shifted, stepping closer to the boat's edge, its wet fur brushing against her leg. A low growl rolled over the water, deeper now, carrying urgency and warning. The mother bear's head lifted slightly, eyes locked on both the cub and the strange shape of the inflatable. The flare gun came free, its cold weight resting in her hand. She raised it toward the pale sky and squeezed the trigger. A burst of light tore through the air, the flare streaking upward before exploding in a shower of bright sparks. The sharp crack echoed across the frozen expanse, startling the cub into a quick shuffle backward. The mother slowed, her strokes becoming more measured as she lifted her head higher, scanning the sky before returning her gaze to the boat. Mia fired again, the second flare sending another loud blast across the water. The mother's growl faded into heavy breaths, her eyes narrowing as she turned slightly to one side. The cub, sensing the shift, slipped back into the water and paddled toward her. They met just beyond the boat, the smaller form circling the larger in the safety of its shadow. After a long moment, the two began moving away, their pale fur blending into the drifting floes until they vanished behind a ridge of ice. The boat rocked gently in the sudden quiet, but the sound of escaping air was sharper now. The puncture had widened, the soft hiss growing with each passing second. Mia took up the paddle and began to work quickly, each stroke sending the craft forward toward the faint outline of the shoreline. The water was still and cold, its surface broken only by the movement of the boat. Every few moments she glanced over her shoulder, watching for any sign of the bears returning. The shore drew closer, jagged rocks rising from the ice-crusted edge. By the time she reached it, the boat sagged visibly, its sides folding inward with the loss of air. She dragged it partway onto the frozen ground before stepping out, her boots crunching against the snow. Her breath came in short, heavy bursts, the sting of the cold air sharp in her lungs. Later that day, she reported the incident to local wildlife officers, detailing the encounter and the location. They listened carefully, noting the behavior of the animals and the unusual curiosity of the cub. The event sparked discussions about the increasing overlap between human activity and polar bear territory, especially in changing ice conditions. In the days that followed, Mia's photographs from earlier that morning became part of her record of the Arctic's shifting balance. Yet the memory of the mother's swift approach and the sound of the boat giving way stayed vivid. The encounter had ended without injury, but the weight of what could have happened lingered like the chill that never left the air. The small town of Cedar Falls, Montana, nestled in the shadow of the Continental Divide, had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the wilderness that surrounded it. Founded in 1892 as a logging settlement, the town's population had dwindled to just over 800 residents by 2025. The local police station, a modest brick building constructed in the 1960s, sat at the edge of town where Main Street dissolved into forest trails. It had endured decades of harsh Montana winters, but nothing had prepared it for the events of the morning of July 10, 2025. Officer Marcus Daniels had drawn the graveyard shift that night, a routine assignment that typically involved little more than monitoring radio chatter and ensuring the station remained secure. At 34 years old, Daniels had served the Cedar Falls Police Department for 8 years, having transferred from Billings after growing tired of urban policing. He appreciated the quiet nature of small-town law enforcement, though he remained aware of the unique challenges that came with working on the edge of grizzly country. The evidence locker at the rear of the station had long been a source of concern among the department's 5 officers. Built as an afterthought during a 1980s renovation, the room lacked proper ventilation and climate control. More troubling was the department's habit of storing confiscated items there temporarily, including food and beverages seized during various investigations. Recent budget cuts had delayed planned improvements to the facility, leaving it vulnerable to exactly the kind of incident that would unfold that morning. At approximately 4:47 a.m., with dawn still more than an hour away, a massive grizzly bear crashed through the station's rear entrance. The animal, later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh nearly 900 pounds, had been drawn by the scent of improperly stored evidence. Among the items in the locker were several cases of beer, bags of snack foods, and camping supplies confiscated during a recent underage drinking citation. The combination of these odors had created an irresistible attraction for the hungry bear. Daniels first became aware of the intrusion when he heard the unmistakable sound of splintering wood and crashing metal from the back of the building. Initially assuming a person was attempting to break into the station, he grabbed his flashlight and service weapon before moving cautiously toward the rear corridor. The sounds grew louder as he approached, joined by aggressive huffing and grunting that sent a cold rush of adrenaline through him. When Daniels rounded the corner and shined his flashlight into the evidence room, he found himself face to face with the enormous grizzly. The bear had completely destroyed several evidence cabinets, scattering their contents across the floor as it searched for food. Claw marks gouged deep furrows into the metal lockers, and the animal's massive frame filled nearly the entire doorway. Daniels immediately recognized the extreme danger of the situation. His police training had covered wildlife encounters, emphasizing the importance of avoiding sudden movements when confronting large predators. He began backing away slowly, keeping the flashlight beam angled toward the ground to avoid appearing threatening. For several tense seconds, the bear seemed to ignore him, continuing to investigate the scattered evidence. The fragile standoff ended abruptly when Daniels accidentally kicked a piece of debris, creating a sharp metallic clang that echoed through the hallway. The grizzly's head snapped up, fixing its small dark eyes on him. The animal dropped to all fours and charged, covering the distance between them in mere seconds. Daniels tried to dodge by, throwing himself against the corridor wall, but the bear's massive paw caught him across the chest and shoulder. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the floor, his flashlight and radio skittering across the tiles. Pain radiated through his body as he fought to remain conscious, feeling the bear's hot breath and hearing its guttural growls just inches from his face. In desperation, Daniels reached for the pepper spray on his duty belt. His hands shook as he fumbled with the safety mechanism, knowing he had only one chance to deploy it effectively. The bear loomed over him, ready for another swipe of its claws. Daniels managed to discharge the entire canister directly into the animal's face, filling the air with a cloud of burning aerosol that sent the grizzly into a frenzy of coughing and head shaking. The pepper spray bought him precious seconds. Struggling through the pain, Daniels retrieved his emergency radio and broadcast a call for backup. His voice was strained with urgency, and although his fellow officers initially found his report hard to believe, the sounds of chaos in the background made the reality clear. Meanwhile, the bear thrashed through the station in a panicked rage, overturning desks and shattering windows. Within minutes, officers Jennifer Hayes and Robert Chen arrived, accompanied by a volunteer firefighter who had heard the call over the scanner. The responders coordinated quickly, using air horns and metal objects to create a deafening barrage of noise. They shouted, banged, and clanged in unison, driving the confused and agitated bear toward an exit. The grizzly finally burst through a shattered front window and disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlights, leaving behind a scene of destruction. Daniels was transported to the regional hospital, where doctors treated him for deep claw marks across his chest and shoulder, along with severe bruising and minor internal injuries. His wounds required 23 stitches and several weeks of recovery, but he avoided permanent damage. In the aftermath, police departments across rural Montana reevaluated evidence storage procedures. Cedar Falls installed secure, wildlife-proof storage containers and reinforced building entrances within weeks. Daniels eventually returned to duty, though the encounter had permanently altered his view of small-town policing. He had always known the wilderness could be unpredictable, but facing 900 pounds of wild fury inside a police station left him with a deeper respect and wariness for the untamed world beyond the town's edge. The morning of February 10th, 2025, low clouds pressed against the coastline as the tide began to slip away from the rocky shore. The beach at Breaker Point stretched wide and gray, scattered with seaweed and tangled driftwood, all silvery and damp from the morning mist. Two hunters, Daniel, age 45, and Luca, age 40, stood near the water's edge, backs aching from the weight of their catch. They had been out since first light, fighting the cold surf with thick gloves and rubber waders, their arms burning as they hauled a 70-pound halibut up the sand. Both men were experienced and quiet by nature, shaped by years of working the edges of wild Alaska. Daniel had once been a guide before leaving that life behind for the stillness of coastal hunting. Luca, his brother-in-law, had come from Juneau, eager for a break from city noise and paperwork. Together, they worked in rhythm, saying little, moving with the care of men who understood what lived just beyond the trees and tides. As they dropped the halibut beside a bleached log, Daniel turned to rinse his gloves in a shallow pool. Luca leaned forward, hands on his knees, panting from exertion but grinning at the catch. The wind shifted faintly. A gull cried overhead. And then, from behind a twisted pile of driftwood, the Kodiak bear moved. It was enormous, copper-coated, and utterly silent. The bulk of it emerged like a shadow peeled off the logs, moving on thick limbs that barely rustled the sand. Luca didn't have time to turn. One moment he stood, hands on hips. The next he was struck with such force that his body lifted off the ground and tumbled through the air, landing hard in a patch of wet sand 10 feet away. His scream was short, more breath than voice. And then he was on his back, arms twisted beneath him, mouth open in shock. Daniel spun too late. The bear was already towering over Luca, its massive forelegs stomping down, pinning his ribs to the beach. There was no sound from the animal, no growl, no roar, no warning at all. Just the heavy exhale of its breath and the dull, wet sound of bones giving way beneath the weight of its paws. Its claws swept once across Luca's upper chest and shoulder, tearing through jacket and skin with equal ease. Blood sprayed sideways, mixing with the foam at the water's edge. Luca gasped and twisted, somehow conscious, his eyes wide and wild. Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to shout, to fire his sidearm. But his limbs were frozen, heart slamming in his chest like it was trying to escape. The bear didn't spare him a glance. It stepped back from Luca, turned to the halibut lying in the sand, and bit down with powerful jaws. The fish folded in half with a sickening crunch. Then, without a single glance back, the bear carried it off into the mist, vanishing toward the tree line like a ghost made of muscle and hunger. Only when the silence returned did Daniel run to Luca's side. The sand was red beneath him. Luca's breathing came in harsh, wet pulls, and one arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder split wide open. His ribs shifted visibly beneath torn fabric. But he was alive. Daniel pressed his jacket into the wounds, blood soaking through almost instantly. His voice shook as he activated the emergency beacon clipped to his belt, the satellite signal pinging far beyond the fog. He spoke into the radio, barely registering what he said, watching Luca's face for signs of slipping away. Minutes felt like hours. It took 40 minutes for the medevac to arrive, the thumping blades breaking through the still air like thunder. Luca had stopped talking by then, his head lolling but eyes still open, blinking slowly. They lifted him on a stretcher, bandaged him mid-air, and disappeared back into the sky. Daniel remained on the beach, shaking, breathing unevenly. The halibut's blood trailed away toward the sea, mixing with Luca's in a tide pool that shimmered red against the rocks. The bear hadn't come to fight. It hadn't shown rage or fear. It had come for food, and Luca had simply been in the way. Later in the hospital, Luca would recover with rods in his ribs and long scars down his chest. His arm regained motion after weeks of therapy, though he couldn't lift it above shoulder height. But the damage that haunted him wasn't physical. He would tell Daniel in low whispers between long silences that what stayed with him most wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the bear's claws or the weight crushing his lungs. It was the moment just before it struck, when everything was still, and he hadn't known death was already rushing toward him. There had been no sound, no warning, just motion and weight. Breaker Point remained quiet. The beach looked unchanged weeks later, fog still clinging to the rocks, driftwood still bleached and tangled. No one came to retrieve the leftover gear. Daniel didn't return to fish there again. He told himself the bear had only acted out of need. It was the hunger of an apex predator, not rage or vengeance. But even now, when he closed his eyes, he saw the blur of muscle behind the logs, the spray of sand, the way Luca's body crumpled like it did not weigh its own. The sea had stayed calm that day. There were no storms, no howls from the woods, no signs that something had gone wrong, just silence. And then, in that silence, something too powerful to stop had arrived, left its mark, and vanished without a sound. On March 3rd, 2025, the early fog still clung to the rolling hills of Napa Valley, wrapping the vineyards in a pale silver mist. Maria, a dedicated vintner in her early 40s, had spent most of her life working among these rows of grapevines. Her family had owned the vineyard for 3 generations, each harvest a blend of tradition, hard work, and love for the land. The sprawling fields stretched across gentle slopes, dotted with oak trees and bordered by old stone walls. At the heart of the property stood a weathered wine cellar built decades ago by her grandfather, its thick wooden door and stone frame still strong despite years of wind and rain. Maria began her mornings before sunrise, walking the rows with a small basket to inspect the ripening grapes. That day, the air was still and heavy with the sweet scent of fruit ready for harvest. Her boots crunched softly over the damp soil as she rounded a bend near the lower vines. That was when she noticed movement among the clusters of grapes. A large black bear stood in the middle of the row, its thick, dark fur glistening with dew. Its head was lowered, muzzle buried in the vines as it tore at bunch after bunch of ripe fruit. Broken stems and scattered grapes lay across the soil, the ground already littered from its feeding. Maria froze for a moment, her breath catching as the predator lifted its head. Juice dripped from its mouth, and its small, dark eyes locked on her with an intensity that made the air feel colder. She took a cautious step forward, clapping her hands and waving her arms, hoping to scare it away. Instead of retreating, the animal stiffened, shoulders rolling forward and lips curling to reveal sharp teeth. A deep growl rumbled from its chest, low and heavy. It began to advance, slow at first, then with deliberate, steady steps that closed the distance between them. Maria's pulse quickened as she backed toward the old wine cellar at the edge of the field. The fog seemed thicker now, the shapes of the vines fading behind her as she moved. The bear's pace quickened, paws pressing into the soil with a dull thud each time. When she reached the heavy wooden door, she threw her weight against it, pulling it open just wide enough to slip inside. The moment she stepped through, the bear lunged. The door slammed shut with a deep, resonating thud as its weight crashed against the outside. The thick wood shuddered under the impact, dust falling from the old beams above. A second blow came almost instantly, followed by the sound of claws scraping deep grooves into the surface. The guttural roars echoed through the still morning, the sound bouncing off the cellar walls and making them tremble. Maria pressed her back against the door, every muscle tense. The pounding continued, each strike making the hinges groan. The scent of crushed grapes and the musty air of the cellar filled her lungs as the relentless attack outside showed no sign of slowing. The heavy blows came one after another, rattling the frame as if it might give way at any moment. Outside, the bear's deep breathing could be heard between strikes, a steady reminder of the strength just beyond the barrier. The air inside the cellar was cool and damp, but Maria's skin was warm with fear. She pressed harder against the wood, bracing her legs against the stone floor, feeling every vibration travel through her body. Dust drifted down from the rafters with each impact, and the scent of aged oak barrels mixed with the earthy smell of soil clinging to her boots. The predator began pacing, its claws scraping along the outer walls, leaving sharp marks in the old wood. Every so often, it returned to the door, delivering another crushing strike that made the hinges creak. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into what felt like hours. Maria's breathing was shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but she remained still, knowing any sound might renew the animal's rage. At one point, the bear's roars grew louder, reverberating through the thick walls. Its weight slammed into the door again, causing the latch to strain against the frame. Small splinters scattered across the floor inside. The sound of paws shuffling outside suggested it was circling again, searching for another way in. The cellar's single small window was far too high for the animal to reach, but its presence under that narrow opening sent a heavy, musky smell drifting inside, making the air even harder to breathe. Suddenly, the noise changed. From somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the fog. The bear's movements became restless, pacing faster, claws striking the walls in quick bursts. A sharp metallic sound rang out as the latch on the door was tested once more, but this time it was followed by heavy thuds retreating toward the vineyard. Maria stayed frozen in place, unwilling to believe it was over. Within minutes, voices and steady footsteps approached, and the door creaked open under careful hands. Wildlife officers stepped inside, their gear still damp from the mist. Outside, more personnel moved through the vines, tools in hand, long poles tipped with bright-colored canisters meant for deterring large predators. 2 officers reported seeing the bear moving toward the property's edge, its form disappearing into the trees as a tranquilizer dart struck deep. Maria emerged slowly, her muscles aching from holding position for so long. The vineyard looked different now. The vines near the cellar flattened, clusters of grapes torn away, deep paw prints pressed into the soft soil. The bear had left its mark not only on the crops, but on the heavy cellar door, where deep grooves cut through the once smooth wood. In the days that followed, neighbors visited to offer support. Discussions began about stronger fencing, motion alarms, and nighttime patrols to keep wildlife at a safe distance. The story of the intrusion spread quickly through the valley, reminding everyone that the line between cultivated land and wild territory was thinner than it seemed. For Maria, the image of the predator's shadow against the morning fog would not fade, a lasting memory of how quickly the peace of the vineyard could be broken. The vast wilderness of Russia's Far East encompasses over 6 million square kilometers of largely untamed territory, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. This region, sparsely populated and dominated by dense taiga forests, is home to one of the world's largest populations of brown bears. The Kamchatka Peninsula, in particular, harbors an estimated 20,000 of these massive predators, some weighing over 1,500 pounds and standing nearly 10 feet tall when upright. In August 2011, 12-year-old Anya Volkov and her 14-year-old brother Misha traveled from their home in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky to spend 2 weeks with their uncle Dmitry, a geologist working in the remote interior. Dmitry operated a small research camp approximately 180 kilometers from the nearest settlement, studying mineral deposits in an area where few humans had ever ventured. The children's parents had agreed to the visit, believing it would provide educational value and strengthen family bonds. The research camp consisted of 3 prefabricated structures surrounded by equipment for core sampling and geological analysis. Dmitry had established the camp in a valley between 2 mountain ridges, providing a natural windbreak and access to a freshwater stream. The location also offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness, though it placed the camp directly in prime bear habitat during the salmon spawning season. On August 23, 2011, Dmitry departed in the early morning for a day-long survey expedition, leaving detailed instructions for the children to remain within sight of the camp. Anya and Misha, however, grew restless after several days of restricted movement and decided to explore a well-marked trail leading up the eastern ridge. The trail had been used by Dmitry for equipment transport and appeared safe for a short hiking excursion. The siblings packed water and snacks before setting out around 10 a.m., planning to reach a scenic overlook approximately 2 kilometers from camp. The weather conditions were ideal for hiking, with clear skies and temperatures near 15 degrees Celsius. The trail wound through dense birch and larch forest, offering occasional glimpses of the valley below and the distant volcanic peaks dominating the horizon. Approximately halfway to their destination, the children encountered a massive grizzly bear sleeping in a shallow depression beside the trail. The bear had excavated the resting spot near the base of a large larch tree, likely seeking cooler ground during the warm afternoon hours. Adult male grizzlies in the region typically weighed between 600 and 800 pounds, though some exceeded 1,000 pounds during peak feeding seasons. Anya, fascinated by wildlife photography since receiving a digital camera for her birthday, recognized the rare opportunity presented by the sleeping bear. Despite her brother's urgent and cautious gestures for her to stay back, she began moving closer to capture what she believed would be remarkable photographs. Misha remained on the trail, approximately 30 meters away, signaling frantically for her to return but avoiding loud noises that might wake the animal. The bear appeared to be in deep sleep, its massive chest rising and falling rhythmically in the afternoon shade. Anya managed to approach within 15 meters, close enough to capture detailed images of the animal's size and thick brown coat. She took several photographs before edging even closer for a more dramatic shot, ignoring Misha's increasingly urgent warnings. The bear awoke suddenly, possibly disturbed by the camera's electronic sounds or Anya's scent carried by shifting air currents. Adult grizzlies can transition from deep sleep to full alertness in seconds, and this animal demonstrated that ability with startling speed. Its small dark eyes locked onto Anya, who stood frozen with her camera raised, fully exposed in the open forest. The grizzly surged from its resting position and charged directly at her, covering the ground between them in less than 3 seconds. Despite their bulk, grizzlies can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour over short distances, making escape nearly impossible once an attack begins. Anya tried to run back toward the trail but had moved only a few steps before the bear's massive paw struck her across the back and shoulders. The impact knocked her to the ground, and the animal followed with additional swipes. Misha, watching in shock from the trail, remained rooted in place, overwhelmed by fear. The incident lasted roughly 30 seconds before the bear, apparently convinced the perceived threat had been eliminated, moved back toward its resting area. It showed no interest in Misha, who remained motionless until the animal disappeared into the dense forest. Only then did he approach his sister, finding injuries that she did not survive. Misha activated an emergency satellite communicator Dmitry had given them, transmitting GPS coordinates and requesting immediate rescue. The nearest emergency response team was based over 200 kilometers away, requiring helicopter transport to reach the location. They arrived approximately 4 hours later, but Anya had already passed away. The rescue team confirmed that the encounter had been a defensive reaction rather than predatory behavior, as shown by the bear's immediate withdrawal after neutralizing the perceived danger. Misha gave a detailed account of the events, information that proved valuable for wildlife authorities investigating the incident. The tragedy prompted enhanced safety protocols for research operations in the Russian Far East, including mandatory bear awareness training and improved emergency communication systems for remote camps. Misha required extensive counseling to address the psychological effects of witnessing his sister's loss, an experience that forever changed his view of the wilderness they had once been eager to explore. The rugged coast of Kodiak Island stretched under a pale morning sky, the air filled with the scent of salt water and fish carried on the wind. Lena, a seasoned wilderness guide in her mid-30s, had spent over a decade leading expeditions into this remote and unforgiving landscape. She was known for her steady judgment, her deep understanding of bear behavior, and her commitment to safety in places where one wrong move could cost a life. Raised in a small Alaskan fishing town, she had grown up surrounded by wildlife and wild weather, learning early that respect for nature was not optional here. Mark, her client for this trip, was a few years younger and carried a restless curiosity. He had traveled from the mainland to experience the raw presence of Kodiak's coastal bears. This was his first close-range wildlife excursion, and though he listened to Lena's instructions at the start, his excitement often pushed him to the edge of caution. The two had set out early to reach a remote beach known for salmon runs that drew some of the largest bears in the region. The shoreline was harsh and beautiful. Jagged rock outcrops split the surf, and dark sand stretched between pools of seawater left by the tide. Seaweed clung to stone, and the sharp cry of gulls cut through the deeper roar of the ocean. The sky was pale but clear, and the distant peaks of the island's mountains faded into mist. Along a shallow stream that cut across the sand, a massive Kodiak bear stood, its fur thick and golden brown, shoulders rippling with each movement. It pulled salmon from the water with swift, practiced strikes, the red fish flashing briefly before vanishing into the grip of its jaws. Lena kept her pace slow, maintaining a wide buffer between them and the animal. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes never leaving the bear's movements. Mark, however, drifted closer, drawn forward by the sight of the predator in its element. He moved ahead along the damp sand, the crunch beneath his boots nearly lost under the crashing surf. The bear's head suddenly lifted, its small, dark eyes fixed on the figure approaching. The space between them, once safe, shrank in an instant. Lena's gut tightened as she recognized the shift in the bear's posture. The weight forward, the low swing of the head, the ears angling back. The charge began without warning. Sand sprayed beneath the bear's paws as it surged forward, closing the distance with frightening speed. The sound of its breathing grew louder, matching the deep thud of its footfalls. Mark froze for a heartbeat before stumbling backward, his movements jerky against the smooth, controlled force of the oncoming animal. Lena broke into a sprint, the wind tearing at her clothes, her boots sinking into wet patches of sand. The crash of the waves seemed to grow sharper around her, blending with the first raw screams that carried down the beach. The sight ahead was chaos, Mark retreating, the bear closing, and no barrier between them as the predator bore down with unrelenting power. The bear collided with Mark in a single crushing impact that drove him onto the wet sand. Its massive paws came down again and again, each blow tearing through the fabric of his jacket and the straps of his gear. The force of its weight shook the ground beneath them, the sound of claws striking stone beneath the thin layer of sand, mixing with the roar of the nearby surf. Water from the shallow stream splashed as the struggle shifted toward the edge of the flow, the current swirling red as it mixed with the tide. Lena closed the gap as fast as she could, her lungs burning from the sprint. The sight was overwhelming. Mark pinned beneath the predator, his arms jerking as he tried to shield his head. The bear's head lowered, jaws closing over his shoulder, and its neck muscles tensed as it shook violently. The sound of tearing fabric and muffled cries filled the air. Lena reached into her pack, pulling free a flare, her fingers working without hesitation despite the shaking in her hands. The first burst of light and smoke cut through the haze. The bright flash caught the animal's attention for only a moment before it pressed back down on its victim. Lena ignited another and waved it wide, moving closer to draw the predator's gaze away. The noise from the burning flare hissed sharply against the steady crash of the waves. At last, the bear shifted its focus, lifting its head toward the figure approaching, with the bright, burning light. The animal stepped back, its breaths heavy and uneven, then turned slightly toward the line of rocks at the far end of the beach. For a long second it lingered, its eyes darting between Lena and the motionless body at its feet. Then it began to move toward the boulders, muscles rolling under its thick coat, every step deliberate as it withdrew. The sound of its movement faded into the jagged shoreline, replaced by the wind and the distant cry of seabirds. Lena dropped to her knees beside Mark. The damage was severe, deep gashes along his arms and torso, and blood pooling quickly beneath him. She tore strips from a spare shirt in her pack, pressing them hard against the worst wounds. Her hands worked frantically, but his breaths were shallow and fading. The cold from the wet sand seeped upward, and the tide edged closer with each passing wave. Minutes dragged before help could reach the remote stretch of coast. When the rescue team finally arrived by boat, they found Lena still beside him, her clothes stained dark, her face set in grim focus. They worked quickly, but the extent of his injuries was beyond what could be treated on site. The effort to save him continued, until it was clear there was nothing more to be done. Mark's body was carried to the boat with care, the sound of the motor starting breaking the stillness. Lena stayed on the shore for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the rocks where the bear had vanished. The beach felt heavier, the wind colder, as the reality of the loss settled over the scene. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly across the island and beyond. Officials reminded visitors that the coast was one of the most dangerous places to approach wildlife, especially during the salmon run. Local guides spoke quietly among themselves about the risks they faced each season, the fine balance between observation and intrusion. For Lena, the image of that morning remained fixed in her mind. The sudden shift in the bear's posture, the charge across the sand, and the moments where time seemed to stretch forever. The shoreline where it happened returned to its natural silence, but for her, it would always carry the weight of what was lost. The wilderness area in northwestern Montana, where wildlife biologist Jenna Blackwood had established her research camp, represented some of the most pristine black bear habitat in North America. Located approximately 40 miles from the nearest road access, the remote valley contained dense mixed forests of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and aspen, providing ideal conditions for studying black bear behavior and population dynamics. The region supported an estimated density of 1 bear per square mile, among the highest concentrations documented in the continental United States. Jenna, a 31-year-old researcher with a regional university in Montana, had spent the previous 3 summers conducting field studies on black bear feeding patterns and territorial behavior. Her current project involved tracking radio-collared bears to document their daily movement patterns and food preferences throughout the summer months. The research required extended stays in remote locations, often camping for weeks at a time in areas where human presence was rare. On June 18, 2013, Jenna had established a temporary camp with 3 research colleagues in a meadow beside a clear mountain stream, approximately 12 miles from their base station. The location offered excellent visibility for radio tracking equipment, while providing access to fresh water and level ground for their tents. The camp consisted of 4 lightweight backpacking tents, a central cooking area, and equipment storage containers arranged in a rough circle around a fire pit. Her companions included graduate student Marcus Reed, research assistant Lisa Yamamoto, and visiting researcher Dr. Robert Chen from a Canadian university. The team had spent the previous week successfully tracking several bears through challenging terrain, gathering valuable data on foraging behavior and habitat preferences. Their work required detailed logs of bear sightings and behavioral observations while minimizing human impact on the environment. Despite their knowledge of bear country protocols, the research team made a critical error in food storage that would prove nearly disastrous. A cooler containing several days' worth of provisions had been left unsecured near their cooking area, rather than being stored in bear-resistant containers or suspended from tree branches. The cooler contained fresh meat, vegetables, and various canned goods, powerful attractants for any bears in the vicinity. During the early morning hours of June 19th, while the researchers slept in their tents, a mature black bear entered their campsite. Adult males in the region typically weighed between 300 and 400 pounds, though exceptional specimens exceeded 500 pounds during peak feeding seasons. This particular bear appeared at the upper end of that range, with the broad skull and massive shoulders characteristic of a dominant male. The bear's initial interest centered on the unsecured cooler, which it opened with casual efficiency using its claws and teeth. The contents offered a high-calorie reward that required no effort, reinforcing the bear's association between human campsites and easy feeding. The situation quickly escalated from opportunistic scavenging to aggressive territorial behavior. Jenna awoke to the sound of destruction outside her tent, initially assuming that a colleague was starting an early breakfast. The metallic clanging and heavy crashes were unusual for normal camp activities, and when she checked her watch, she saw that it was barely 4 a.m., well before their usual wake-up time. Looking out from her tent, She immediately recognized the danger. The large black bear had destroyed their cooking area and was tearing into equipment storage containers. Scattered food packaging covered the ground, and their organized research station had been reduced to chaos in minutes. Grabbing a flashlight and a metal camping pot, Jenna began making as much noise as possible to alert the others and deter the bear. She struck the pot with a metal spoon and raised her voice in an attempt to scare the animal away before anyone was harmed. The bear ignored her, continuing to destroy supplies. The noise woke the rest of the team, who emerged to find the camp in disarray. 2 tents had been torn open, with sleeping bags and personal gear scattered across the meadow. One of the research laptops had been crushed beneath the bear's paws, destroying weeks of collected data. Instead of retreating, the bear suddenly charged toward Jenna. Although smaller than grizzlies, black bears can reach speeds over 30 miles per hour and have formidable strength. The animal's behavior suggested it was defending what it now considered its food cache. Jenna attempted to move out of its path by diving behind a large boulder, but the bear's momentum brought it directly toward her. A powerful swipe from its forepaw struck her shoulder and upper back, knocking her to the ground with force. Its claws tore through her jacket, though fortunately not deeply enough to cause severe lacerations. In desperation, Jenna seized her hiking stick, a sturdy aluminum pole designed for mountaineering, and struck the bear across the nose. The impact caused the animal to recoil briefly, giving her enough time to scramble out of immediate reach. The bear recovered quickly, preparing to charge again. Marcus Reed moved to assist her, while Lisa Yamamoto and Dr. Chen worked to rapidly increase the campfire to a bright blaze. The combination of strong flames, loud human voices, and the coordinated actions of the group began to shift the bear's behavior. It hesitated, appearing uncertain, and eventually backed away from the immediate area. The standoff lasted several tense minutes before the bear retreated into the forest. It remained near the tree line for nearly an hour before vanishing completely. For the rest of the night, the team stayed close to the fire, assessing the damage and tending to Jenna's injuries, which included deep scratches across her shoulders and significant bruising from the blow. The encounter underscored the importance of strict food storage protocols, even for experienced researchers working in prime bear habitat. Just after sunrise on September 12, 2020, on the Shantar Islands, a chain of wild, forested lands in the far reaches of the Russian Far East. A light mist rolled off the sea, softening the outlines of spruce trees and dampening every sound. Nearby, a fisherman named Oleg, 48, seasoned and solitary, had woken early to check his tide nets, anchored in the shallows of the rocky cove. His small camp was tucked beneath the trees, far enough from the sea winds, but close enough to smell the salt. He had noticed the family 2 days prior. A Russian couple in their late 30s with 3 children, aged 4 to 10. They had arrived by boat, waving politely, and set up their green tent about 50 meters inland, sheltered between birch trunks. They had the look of people chasing a peaceful escape. Neatly packed gear, warm coats, and quiet laughter that drifted across the shore. Oleg thought little of them after that. The Shantars were remote but not deserted, and he respected other people's solitude. That morning, as he moved toward the water, he noticed a large shape lumbering at the tree line. He froze, instinct taking over. At first, it looked like a trick of the fog, a brown blur between trunks. Then it stepped clear into view. It was massive. A full-grown grizzly, easily 900 pounds, its coat thick with dirt, its shoulders hunched like boulders beneath its matted fur. The bear was starved, bones visible beneath the hide, eyes sunken, movements desperate. It sniffed the air, lifted its head toward the trees, then turned slowly toward the clearing where the family's tent stood. Oleg's breath caught. He crouched instinctively, ducking behind a driftwood log, his heart beginning to hammer. The bear walked with eerie calm, silent, except for the dull crackle of dry leaves beneath its paws. It was heading straight for the tent, low and steady, as if it already knew where to go. Oleg wanted to shout, to run forward, to make noise, but he didn't move. Something primal pinned him in place, something colder than fear, the realization that he was watching something inevitable. The bear closed the last 10 meters in seconds, then surged forward. Its body slammed into the side of the tent like a truck, the fabric collapsing instantly under its weight. There was no time for anyone inside to react. The canvas exploded outward as claws tore through it, flinging pieces of gear and fabric into the clearing. The man inside, broad-shouldered, still groggy with sleep, was the first to be hit. Oleg saw his arm come up instinctively, trying to block, but the bear's paw knocked him back like a rag doll. The crack of bone echoed across the trees. The man rolled once, then went still. The bear didn't pause. It lunged at the center of the tent again, jaws snapping as the mother shrieked, her body flung sideways in a blur of motion and hair. She scrambled toward the children, but the bear knocked her flat with a single swipe, her head striking a rock with a sickening sound that ended her screams. One child, maybe the eldest, a boy, bolted through a tear in the tent, barefoot, legs pumping. He made it only a few steps before the bear spun, faster than seemed possible, and caught him with a lunge. Its jaws clamped down on the boy's back and dragged him violently across the ground, lifting him partially off the dirt before tossing him aside like meat too small to satisfy. The other two children huddled in the far corner of the tent, clinging to each other. Oleg saw them for a second, two tiny forms tangled in sleeping bags, eyes wide with terror. The bear turned back toward them. There was no hesitation in its movement, no mercy in its gaze. It lunged once more into the wreckage of the tent, its paws thundering into the earth, claws ripping. One child was struck instantly, the body thrown against the tree trunk. The other, a little girl, managed to crawl a few feet before the bear crushed her beneath its weight. It was over as quickly as it began. 4 minutes, maybe less. Silence fell again, thick and unnatural. The bear stood in the ruins of the tent, sides heaving, blood staining its snout and chest. Oleg hadn't moved. His legs were numb, his stomach twisted into knots. He could smell the copper in the air from where he crouched. He had seen death before, hunting, fishing, accidents at sea. But never like this. Never this fast. Never this final. The bear sniffed the ground, then lifted its head and looked toward the trees. For one horrifying second, Oleg thought it had seen him. But the bear turned and walked back the way it had come, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had arrived. Only when it was gone did Oleg rise, his legs trembling under his weight. He stumbled forward, not sure what he could do. There was nothing left to save. The campsite was torn to shreds. Blood was everywhere, in the grass, on the trees, soaked into clothing and sleeping bags. The silence was broken only by the soft flap of torn fabric in the breeze. When he finally radioed for help, his voice shook. Hours later, when rescue crews arrived by boat, they found him still kneeling near the edge of the clearing, pale and trembling, his hands stained red. The bodies were recovered, each marked by violent trauma, their positions a chilling map of the bear's merciless path. The investigation confirmed what Oleg had said. No food was left out. No mistakes were made. The family had followed every safety rule. It hadn't mattered. The bear had been starving. Desperation had overridden fear. It had hunted like a predator, not scavenged like a forager. It had come for blood, not scraps. In the days that followed, Oleg didn't sleep much. He stayed in his cabin, doors locked, rifle loaded. He kept seeing the moment the bear crashed through the tent, kept hearing the crack of bone and the sudden quiet. On the Shantar Islands, nature didn't ask permission, and when it struck, it gave no warnings. July 17th, 2025, began warm and bright in the rugged backcountry of Montana, where miles of twisting roads cut through endless forest and rolling hills. The Williams family had been on the road for several days, traveling in their luxury RV, a gleaming $300,000 machine. John, the father, had spent years saving for the vehicle, seeing it as both a family retreat and a way to explore the country's most remote landscapes. Beside him in the passenger seat was his wife, Linda, whose love for quiet scenery and wide skies had shaped many of their travel routes. In the back, their two children, Alex and Sophie, played a quiet game, the hum of the road a steady background. The RV, built for comfort but not for sudden, violent movement, carried them steadily deeper into the wilderness. The road that morning wound like a ribbon through dense stands of pine, their branches heavy with summer growth. Shadows shifted over the windshield as the vehicle climbed a gradual incline. The air inside was cool from the air conditioning, masking the heat pressing down outside. Wildlife sightings had been rare on this stretch, only the occasional deer far off in a meadow. The narrow pavement left little room on either side, with steep drop-offs in some areas and walls of brush in others. John kept a careful pace, mindful of the tight curves and limited visibility. Without warning, movement exploded from the greenery to their right. A grizzly bear of enormous size burst out of the brush less than 10 feet from the RV, its fur bristling and its mouth gaping in a roar that cut through the quiet. The ground seemed to shudder under its pounding stride as it charged toward the side of the moving vehicle. Its speed was terrifying, its bulk seeming to fill the world outside the windows in an instant. John's instincts reacted before thought could form. His foot slammed down on the brake pedal while his hands yanked the steering wheel sharply to the left, trying to avoid hitting the animal. The sudden maneuver was too much for the RV's top-heavy frame. The tires screamed against the asphalt before losing their grip entirely. Metal groaned and glass rattled as the vehicle tipped. In the next heartbeat, the RV rolled onto its side, sliding a short distance before coming to a shuddering stop. Inside, chaos erupted. The family was thrown against the walls and furniture, objects from cupboards and shelves raining down. The sharp sound of shattering glass mixed with the thuds of heavy items striking the floor. Through the side windows now facing the sky, the blur of green trees spun past, then stilled. The smell of fuel and dust filled the air. Linda braced herself against the nearest wall, her shoulder aching from the impact. The children's voices trembled as they tried to steady themselves, their eyes wide with shock. The roar from outside came again, closer this time, deep and resonant, vibrating through the frame of the RV. The bear had not retreated. Instead, it moved toward the tipped vehicle, claws clicking faintly against the road surface as it approached the metal shell that had landed in its path. The grizzly moved with slow, deliberate steps, circling the fallen RV as if trying to understand the strange shape blocking the road. Its massive head turned side to side, nostrils flaring at the scent of people and spilled food from the cupboards. Deep scratches appeared along the metal as it dragged its claws across the side, the screech of tearing paint echoing through the narrow pass. Inside, the family stayed as still as possible, the air heavy with tension and the sharp smell of dust and gasoline. The vehicle's frame creaked under the shifting weight of the predator pressing against it. Emergency sirens in the distance broke the heavy quiet. Faint at first, they grew louder, carrying through the trees. The bear paused, its ears twitching toward the sound. For a moment, it stepped back, glancing toward the forest, but the lure of the overturned RV kept it close. Wildlife officers were the first to arrive, their truck skidding to a stop a short distance away. They moved quickly but carefully, pulling long canisters of bear spray and setting off loud, sharp bursts of sound that cracked through the still air. The grizzly reacted with a grunt, stepping away from the RV. The bright spray misted in its direction, making it rear slightly and turn toward the cover of the trees. With heavy strides, it retreated into the dense brush, breaking branches as it vanished into the wild. The officers held their positions for several minutes, watching the undergrowth for any sign of a return before moving toward the damaged vehicle. Rescue crews arrived moments later, working to help the family climb out through the side door now facing upward. Hands reached down to guide each person to the road, their feet crunching on scattered glass and debris. Linda's arm was scraped and sore. John's shoulder bore a deep bruise, and both children had cuts along their arms and faces from flying shards. Despite the injuries, none were in critical condition. Medical staff cleaned wounds, wrapped bandages, and checked for signs of shock before loading the family into an ambulance for further care. The RV sat on its side like a broken shell, one window cracked wide open, cupboards hanging loose, and personal belongings scattered across the road. Fuel and water leaked in thin streams toward the ditch, and the scent of crushed food drifted into the air. Officers marked the spot, noting the deep claw marks on the metal and the wide paw prints leading into the forest. Later that day, wildlife trackers followed the bear's trail deep into the mountains, confirming it had moved far from the road. Officials stressed the importance of keeping travel speeds low in such areas and remaining alert for sudden movement near dense vegetation. The Williams family spent the night in a small lodge in a nearby town, their bodies sore from the violent roll and their thoughts heavy with what could have happened. By the next morning, the damaged RV had been towed away, leaving only scraped pavement and broken glass as signs of the event. The story spread quickly, reminding travelers that even the safety of a large vehicle could be shattered in seconds by the wild strength of a determined predator. For the family, the echo of that roar and the sight of the bear's shadow passing outside the window would remain a memory carried far beyond Montana's winding roads. The mountain air was sharp with the first bite of autumn on September 19, 2022, as Eli Branner dragged another moose quarter across the moss-slicked stone. At 41, Eli was lean and weathered, a third-generation hunter raised in the backcountry of Alaska, where his father taught him to dress meat before he could read. He moved with purpose, boots silent on the earth, skin flushed with the strain of packing out nearly 300 pounds of meat from a successful moose kill deep in an alpine basin. Beside him, Joel Cutler, 39, broad-shouldered and quieter by nature, staggered forward with the rear haunches balanced over one shoulder. He had a thick beard and a fresh limp from slipping earlier on a wet boulder. Behind them, Travis Merrill, the youngest at 27, hauled the last load strapped across his back, rib cage and neck bones bundled under a tarp. Travis had grown up in Anchorage, newer to backcountry hunting but obsessed with it, drawn to the wild like a moth to flame. They were on the third trip of the day, hauling meat uphill to cache it overnight, their rifles slung loosely on their backs. The trail curved past a narrow ravine, lined with alder and stunted spruce, where the wind picked up, sweeping from the valley below, and with it came a sudden, sour heat, thick, animal, pungent. Eli froze mid-step. His eyes narrowed. That scent was not moose. It wasn't even fresh kill. It was heavier, ranker, the unmistakable stench of bear. Before he could speak, the brush to their right exploded in a deafening crash. A wall of fur and motion shot from the undergrowth with a force that felt more like a landslide than a living thing. The Kodiak bear hit the edge of their trail at a full sprint, massive, low-slung, impossibly fast for its size. Joel dropped his load and stumbled, boots skidding on the rocks. His rifle flipped off his shoulder and clattered away down the trail. Eli barely had time to register the sheer size of the thing. It was unlike any bear he'd ever seen, and he'd hunted Kodiaks his whole life. Its body looked nearly as wide as a compact car, its fur dark with glints of brown, its eyes locked forward. Travis, already dropping his meat bundle, yanked the shotgun off his shoulder, stepped sideways, and raised it as the beast came crashing toward them. He fired once, a deafening roar that sent a slug into the animal's front shoulder. The shot hit solid, and the bear recoiled, but only for a fraction of a second. The giant didn't flinch. It pivoted, swinging its massive head and barreling into their makeshift camp just up the slope, nothing more than a tarp shelter rigged between two boulders. The bear tore through it without slowing. Poles snapped, fabric shredded, and cooking gear flew through the air. Joel was struggling to his knees, trying to reach his rifle, but the bear was between him and the weapon. It turned again, now upright on its hind legs. For a moment, the whole world seemed to pause. The thing rose higher and higher, easily pushing 12 feet tall, its massive frame heaving with breath. Blood flowed down its front leg from the shotgun wound, staining the fur dark red. Its face was calm, terrifyingly calm, like something far too confident in its strength. Eli braced for another charge, his heart pounding, as he finally gripped his rifle in both hands. But the bear didn't come forward. Instead, it tilted its head and let out a deep, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through their bones and seemed to settle in the dirt around them. Then it slowly backed into the tree line, disappearing without turning its back, fading into the shadowy timber like it had never been there. The silence afterward was crushing. No birds, no wind, just the distant rattle of a spilled pan clinking against stone. Joel sat breathing heavily, hands scraped and bleeding. Travis was shaking, shotgun still pointed toward the trees. Eli kept his rifle aimed where the bear had vanished, finger hovering on the trigger long after it was gone. They stayed frozen for over a minute. Then Joel retrieved his rifle, and Travis checked the chamber of his shotgun, his fingers fumbling as he did so. Eli scanned the edge of the timber, watching for any sign that the bear might circle back. It never did. Later that night, back at a lower camp by the river, they tried to make sense of what they'd seen. They reported the incident by satellite phone to rangers in Kodiak. By morning, a pair of rangers had been flown in by helicopter and hiked the trail with them. The bear's prints were found easily. Deep impressions, more like potholes than tracks, sunk several inches into the moss and dirt. One front print measured nearly 18 inches across. It was the largest set of Kodiak tracks recorded on the island in over 10 years. Based on the stride, the rangers estimated the bear weighed somewhere between 1,600 and 1,700 pounds, almost 100 pounds heavier than any tagged in recent memory. The tarp site looked like a bomb had hit it. The aluminum poles were bent into zigzags, and the ground was torn in long, gouging swipes. The bloody trail from the slug wound vanished in the thick forest beyond, and though the rangers followed it for over 2 miles, the tracks disappeared into steep scree where even a bear that size left no mark. The rangers took notes, snapped photos, and promised to alert other hunters in the region, but nothing more came of it. Over the next few weeks, Eli scoured the island, returning to that alpine pass twice, hoping to catch another glimpse or find new tracks. But there was nothing. No scat, no prints, no sightings reported by other hunters. It was as if the bear had melted into the mountains. But Eli couldn't shake the image. Not the charge, not the height of it as it rose above them like a nightmare given shape. And not the way it looked at them before disappearing. Not like a wounded animal retreating, but like a king surveying trespassers. The story spread quietly among hunting circles, never made national news, never reached beyond the island. But among those who heard it, the legend grew. The bear that didn't run. The bear that took a shotgun slug and stood taller than any man. The bear that vanished. And somewhere in the backcountry above Ugak Bay, in the timber no one dared camp near again, that legend waited on 4 legs, silent and unseen, larger than belief. On July 20th, 2005, along the jagged coastline of British Columbia, where the conifers crowd the bluffs and the sea moves slowly and heavily beneath an overcast sky, Ellis walked alone, just as he had most evenings since retiring from the shop floor. At 71, with one stiff knee and a shoulder that ached when the rain rolled in, he had traded in his toolbox for quiet afternoons and the rhythm of waves against stone. The fishing camp, little more than a loose scattering of cabins and smoke-tanged tents, sat nestled among the spruce behind him. But he had wandered out with the falling light to walk the tide line, something he had done for years, mostly in silence, mostly without being missed. The air that evening carried the bite of distant salt, cold enough to flush the skin, but not enough to drive a man indoors. Ellis moved at his own pace, scanning the rocks and driftwood piles for something unusual, something weathered just right or shaped by the tide into something worth carving. He had taken up whittling in retirement, not out of boredom, but because shaping something slow and deliberate with his own hands made him feel in some small way like he was still building something, still making something of use in a world that had long since stopped demanding his labor. As he moved across the uneven stones, the tide low and patient beside him, he found himself stepping closer to a thicket where the forest reached nearly to the water's edge. There, the sand narrowed into a wedge of wet shale and seaweed, and the trees leaned forward like watchers, their trunks thick and moist with moss, branches heavy with fog-dampened needles. He crouched briefly, brushing his fingers along a twisted branch caught between 2 stones, then straightened slowly, knees popping, and turned to scan the shoreline once more. That was when he heard it. A sudden rush of motion, the sharp crack of brush being parted in a panic, and then, without warning or buildup, a large black bear burst from the tree line at full speed, its body low and wide, muscles flexing beneath thick fur still wet from whatever undergrowth it had shoved through. It was not charging in aggression, nor aiming with intent, but simply running, startled perhaps by some scent or distant sound. and Ellis, caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment, was directly in its path. The collision happened too fast for thought. The full weight of the bear slammed into him with the force of something neither violent nor gentle, just absolute. A sudden presence that bore him backward onto the rocks. His shoulder struck first, dislocating instantly with a sickening pop, and then the rest of his body followed, folding hard against the cold stone. The bear, just as disoriented as he was, stumbled briefly. In the chaos of movement, one of its claws raked across his left hip, a shallow but tearing slice that opened flesh and fabric alike, before the animal sprang past him and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the echo of its breathing and the scent of fur and earth. Ellis lay flat against the shale, stunned and breathless, the impact ringing through his ribs and shoulder, while blood soaked steadily into the fabric of his pants. The air was colder now. The light had dimmed further, the dusk moving quickly into something closer to night. And the tide, unnoticed before, had begun its slow, deliberate rise toward his feet. He blinked at the sky, unable to fully process what had just happened, only dimly aware of the pain swelling in waves along his hip and across the arm he could no longer move. And yet, he knew with startling clarity that no one was coming for him. The others were back at camp, busy with fish and fire and stories that came easier with distance from the water's edge. No one had heard anything. No one had seen the bear. If he stayed where he was, the tide would come. The cold would seep deeper into his bones, and whatever had spared him so narrowly might not spare him again. So he moved. With his right arm dragging his weight and his legs trailing stiffly behind him, Ellis began to crawl along the uneven shoreline, his teeth clenched so tightly that his jaw ached with every inch gained. The pain was sharp and immediate with each movement, his hip sending spikes of agony up through his side, his shoulder useless, twisted out of place. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The cold was deepening, and the beach ahead of him looked longer than he remembered. He passed pools of tidewater reflecting the first faint glimmer of stars. He slid over slick stones and sharp shells, through patches of seaweed and broken driftwood. He moved without speaking, without crying out, without anything but the sound of his breath and the dull slap of blood against fabric. The half-mile back to camp stretched into something endless, every inch hard-won, every pause a battle between pain and instinct. When he reached the edge of camp, lantern light flickering weakly between the trees, he was barely able to lift his head. The world swam around him in waves of gray and black. His mouth was dry. His limbs were shaking. When one of the younger men spotted him crawling from the brush, blood-streaked and silent, dragging himself on one arm like something that had clawed its way up from the sea, they didn't know what to say. He didn't offer them a story. Not right away. There had been no roar, no dramatic mauling, no prolonged fight or savagery. Just a single moment. One fraction of a second where instinct met instinct and the weight of wildness touched him. Not with hatred, but with the indifferent force of something that simply was. They didn't believe him at first. It sounded too quiet, too subtle. But the torn jacket, the claw marks, the swelling around his shoulder, and the blood still fresh on the rocks told the rest of the story. Later, no one blamed the bear. They understood, as Ellis did, that what had happened wasn't an attack. It wasn't malicious. It was motion and collision, surprise and reaction, the unavoidable cost of sharing space with creatures that live not by intention, but by immediacy. He healed slowly. The shoulder was reset, the hip stitched and dressed, but the wound that stayed wasn't physical. Afterward, when he returned to the tide line weeks later, he walked the beach with his eyes on the tree line, his ears tuned not to the waves or the gulls overhead, but to the sound beneath those things, the breath beneath the birdsong, the possibility of movement in the silence. Because what stayed with him wasn't fear. It was awareness. It was knowing that the wild didn't roar to announce itself. It didn't always strike with rage or hate. Sometimes it simply moved through you, fast and without warning, and then disappeared again, leaving behind nothing but pain, memory, and the sense that something vast and unknowable had passed inches from taking you, and simply chose not to. Night settled deep and still over the lower Appalachians on May 14th, 2019, blanketing the rugged forest in silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Colin Reyes, 27, a solitary climber from Asheville, had chosen a remote granite cliff face for a solo trip to test his skills and escape the chaos of daily life. He was lean, hardened by years of rock climbing and outdoor survival, his skin weathered by sun and wind, his hands toughened by cold granite and rope. His climbing pack was minimal but efficient: ropes, carabiners, food, and a small tent. That evening, after a long day of scaling sheer walls, Colin had settled on a wide ledge about halfway up the cliff, nearly 100 meters above the forest floor. It was just large enough to spread his sleeping bag and stash his gear. The rock was cool beneath him, bathed in faint moonlight that filtered through broken clouds. He was exhausted but content, savoring the solitude as he prepared to rest before pushing higher the next day. Colin was aware of the risks associated with this type of camping. Bears were common here, especially black bears that roamed the mountain slopes following well-worn goat paths. He had taken care to secure his food away from the ledge, hanging it as far from his sleeping area as possible, or so he thought. But nature rarely followed plans. As the night deepened, the air grew colder and heavier. Colin drifted into uneasy sleep, muscles aching but mind alert to every whisper and shadow. Just before dawn, the silence was shattered. A harsh, rasping sound echoed across the granite, the unmistakable scrape of claws against rock, sharp and slow, deliberate. Colin's eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The noise was close, almost beneath him. A shadow moved beyond the faint circle of his headlamp. A black bear had climbed onto the ledge. The bear was large, male, judging by the thick neck and broad shoulders, and its glossy black fur shimmered wet from dew or melted snow. It had followed the mountain goat trails, and the scent of Colin's camp had drawn it in. The bear froze, nostrils flaring, eyes reflecting the dim light. Suddenly it lunged. Claws slashed viciously across Colin's left arm, tearing through his jacket and skin, sending searing pain radiating through muscle and bone. Teeth clamped hard onto his shoulder, crushing flesh and ripping deep puncture wounds. Colin's breath hitched. His body jerked instinctively, fighting the shock and the rising fear. With his right hand, the only free one, he grabbed a loose rock resting near the ledge's edge. He struck the bear's snout again and again, desperate and wild, pounding the tough muzzle with heavy blows. The bear growled, a low, guttural rumble that shook the granite beneath them, but Colin's blows landed hard. Blood welled from the bear's nose and stained the black fur red. Stunned and disoriented, the bear stumbled backward, claws scraping the rock as it scrambled down the steep slope, disappearing swiftly into the thick underbrush below. Colin sagged against the granite, chest heaving with ragged breaths. Pain radiated through his arm and shoulder, waves of burning and aching that pulsed with each heartbeat. Blood poured freely from deep punctures and torn muscle, dripping onto the rough rock below, pooling in thin rivulets. His mind raced. He knew he had minutes before blood loss and shock could overwhelm him. The mountain was far from any road or quick help, but his survival instincts sharpened. He reached into his pack, pulling out the climbing rope. Using practiced hands, he fashioned a makeshift tourniquet around his upper arm, twisting it tightly enough to slow the bleeding, but not so much as to stop circulation entirely. His fingers trembled violently, slick with sweat and blood, but the knot held firm. With great effort, Colin prepared for descent. The ledge was narrow and precarious, but the cliff dropped sheer below. He secured his harness, clipped into the anchor bolts he had drilled earlier in the day, and began to rappel. Each movement sent jagged jolts of agony through his shoulder and arm. His legs shook, muscles screaming with exhaustion and pain, but he forced himself down, lowering slowly and carefully. The wind tugged at his jacket, carrying the cold scent of pine and earth as the forest floor drew closer with every passing moment. After a tense and painful rappel of about one rope length, Colin reached a small outcropping, a place he could rest and collect himself. There, he pulled out his emergency beacon from his pack, hands numb and clumsy from injury and cold. Sweat and blood blurred his vision as he fumbled the device open and pressed the activation button. A flashing red light blinked to life. Help was on the way. The hours that followed were a cruel blur of cold, pain, and fatigue. Night gave way to morning, stars wheeling overhead, and Colin fought waves of dizziness and weakness. The dark thoughts that sometimes haunted solo climbers, the fear of never being found, circulated in his mind. But the beacon had been activated. He was not alone. Just after noon, rescue helicopters sliced through the forest canopy below, their rotors stirring the air with a deafening roar. Paramedics rappelled down the cliff face to reach him. Their steady hands worked quickly, stabilizing his shoulder and wrapping his wounds with sterile bandages. Colin's relief was profound, mingled with exhaustion that pulled at his limbs like lead. At the hospital, surgeons confirmed severe puncture wounds and torn muscles in his left shoulder. Surgery was necessary to clean the wounds and repair damaged tissue. The recovery would be long and painful, but full healing was expected. Meanwhile, wildlife officers investigating the site found discarded food wrappers near the base of the trail. It was clear Colin had underestimated the bear's sense of smell and agility. The bear had ventured higher than expected, lured by the scent of food left too close or improperly stored. The incident sent ripples through the climbing community. Experienced climbers shared warnings, and local rangers issued guidelines on food storage and campsite security, especially when bivouacking on cliffs and ledges where wildlife encounters were rare but potentially deadly. For Colin, the memory of the attack lingered far longer than the pain in his shoulder. The scariest part, he later said, wasn't the injury or the blood, but the moment he watched that massive black bear skillfully climb the granite ledge beside him, its dark eyes fixed on him with equal parts curiosity and caution. The wilderness was close and wild, closer than he had imagined, and it was unforgiving. April 11th, 2019, in a national park in northwestern Montana, where alpine meadows slip into dark pine forests and spring snow lingers in the shade, Dana Walsh moved through the trees alone. She was 32, a certified wilderness first responder with years of backcountry rescue under her belt. The solo exercise was a test, 72 hours with minimal gear, no outside contact, designed to simulate disconnection and the stress of survival. She carried just the basics: a tarp, water filter, small ration kit, medical pouch, and bear spray clipped to her hip. The instructors would monitor from afar, but she would see no one. On the second morning, light broke gently across the ridgelines, melting patches of snow into the soil. Dana had made camp by a narrow stream, packed up early, and was moving uphill into denser forest. The trees grew tighter as she climbed, branches wet with dew, boots crunching softly through old needles. She felt strong, focused, and tuned into every sound. But something shifted mid-morning. She paused near a cluster of boulders, wiping her brow, and noticed a print in the melting snow beside her boot. It was deep, wide, and the claw marks were visible even in the slush. A grizzly, not more than a few hours old. Her stomach tightened. Just beyond the rocks, she spotted a pile of scat, loose, packed with berries, steam still faintly rising. Too fresh. She straightened, her hand drifting instinctively toward her bear spray. Then the branches broke. The sound was sudden, violent. A blur of motion exploded from the trees uphill. The bear was massive, with matted brown fur, shoulders high and round like boulders. It moved with speed that didn't match its size, crashing through brush straight for her. Dana reached for the spray, but the clip stuck for a heartbeat too long. She ran, or tried to. Her foot caught loose shale at the edge of a slope, and her body twisted mid-step. She went down hard, sliding through gravel and broken rock, landing chest first on a flat slab below. Pain fired through her ribs. She gasped, trying to move, her pack cushioning a little. The wind had been knocked out of her, and her vision blurred. Above her, the bear paused. It stood at the top of the slope, watching her. Its breath came in heavy huffs, misting into the cold morning air. Then it descended, not in a rush, not with teeth bared, but slow and deliberate, each step placed with eerie control. Gravel shifted beneath its weight as it came closer, filling her ears with crunching dread. Dana didn't move. She couldn't. Her ribs throbbed, and her lungs fluttered like they didn't know what to do. Her right arm had gone numb. The bear reached her in seconds and towered over her, close enough that she could hear the thick pull of its breathing, see the twitch of its nostrils as it sniffed the air around her face. Then it pressed one massive paw against her chest. The pressure was heavy, almost crushing, but not sharp. Claws didn't dig in. The paw just held there for a second or two, testing the weight, testing resistance, as if deciding whether this was prey, threat, or something else. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her entire body locked down. And then the bear lifted its paw, turned, and walked away. Slowly, without a sound of struggle or aggression, it vanished into the trees above, its back swaying slightly with each stride. Within moments, it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Dana stayed down. She didn't try to move for what felt like hours. Time distorted around the pain in her chest and the ghost of pressure that remained. The sun pushed through the branches, shadows shifting across her face. Her breathing remained shallow and labored. At one point, she tried to sit up and nearly blacked out from the ache that shot through her ribs. She waited until dusk. Only then did she crawl, inch by inch, back toward the lower slope, finally making camp in a hollow between rocks. She wrapped her ribs with strips of spare clothing, swallowed water with shaking hands, and spent the night beneath her tarp, listening to every snap of twig and brush of wind. She finished the exercise. The following day, she arrived at the pickup zone on time. When the instructors asked how it went, she said little. She passed the physical with bruised ribs and hidden pain, never revealing what had happened. There were no bite marks, no photos, no injury that screamed trauma. Just faint paw-shaped bruising and the silence of someone who had been very close to the edge and walked away. Years passed. Dana continued working on the rescue. She became a trainer, teaching others how to move through wild places with respect, caution, and control. People often asked about her toughest call. She never mentioned the national park, never talked about the bear. But the memory remained, not as a nightmare of claws or growls or blood, but of stillness, of the moment when breath became the only thing left between her and death. The bear hadn't been enraged. It hadn't lashed out blindly. It had looked at her and tested. That touch, light for its strength, had been enough to communicate what words never could. And sometimes in the quiet between calls, she would remember that weight, not as a trauma, but as a presence. The feeling of the forest holding its breath, of something ancient deciding her fate without violence. It was the not knowing, not whether she would live or die, but when, and whether it would be her breath that stayed or stopped. That uncertainty never left her. It lived quietly inside her, tucked into the hollow between her ribs, still breathing. The late summer evening had settled deep over the remote valley carved by rivers and ancient glaciers in the heart of the Slovakian Carpathians. It was August 21st, 2018. And the forest surrounding the small clearing where three friends had made camp was alive with the murmurs of night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the warm breeze, and distant calls of owls from the dense spruce and fir. The air was thick with the rich scent of pine needles, moss, and damp earth, heavy from a recent afternoon rain. Mist curled low among the hills, rolling in slow, ghostly waves that seemed to swallow the trees in a soft, pale shroud. Zoltan was a tall, rugged man in his early 30s, his skin sun-browned and weathered from years spent working outdoors as a lumberjack and farmer. His broad shoulders bore the scars of labor and life in the wilderness, and his hands were rough, cracked from wielding axes and tending to animals. His two companions, Marek and Jan, both sturdy men from their mountain village, had joined him for a birthday weekend away from the towns and traffic, seeking freedom in the wild. They carried the laughter and careless energy of youth and friendship, oblivious to the ancient power that pulsed just beyond the firelight. Their camp was set near the edge of a forest that had long been home to Eurasian brown bears. The animals roamed these mountains in small, secretive populations, wary of humans, but always close. The clearing was a small break in the wilderness, carpeted with soft grass and wildflowers, surrounded by towering firs that swayed gently with the breeze. The fire they built sputtered and crackled, its flickering glow dancing over their faces and casting giant shadows on the tree trunks. As night deepened, the men drank steadily, their voices growing louder and less restrained. The warmth of the alcohol flowed through their veins, dulling caution and sharpening bravado. Soon, their laughter became howls, their voices echoing into the darkness, unnatural and jarring amid the forest's quiet. They began banging pots and pans with reckless abandon, the clangs and rattles tearing through the stillness. Their calls and taunts were crude, meant to mock the invisible wildlife, the bears, wolves, and other creatures that shared this land. They jeered and howled, summoning the king of the forest, a foolish challenge whispered across the valley. Far beyond the glow of their firelight, in the depths of the forest, a large Eurasian brown bear stirred. She was a female, heavily built and coated in thick brown fur, mottled with dirt and brambles. Her eyes were dark and sharp, reflecting a wary intelligence born from years of survival in these harsh mountains. Two small cubs huddled silently in a nearby den, hidden beneath a fallen tree. The bear's muscles twitched as the cacophony of noise pierced her domain, a sound unnatural and threatening. The bear rose and padded forward, moving through the dense underbrush with quiet power, drawn by the noise and possibly the smell of food scraps left carelessly near the camp. The scent of alcohol and human waste mingled in the cool air, stirring her instincts and raising her guard. Zoltan was the first to see her emerge from the shadows. The massive shape stepped into the circle of firelight, towering and imposing. His heart raced, but the drink clouded his judgment. Rather than retreat, he raised a flashlight and advanced toward the bear, his steps uneven and unsteady on the soft grass. The beam of light flickered wildly across the bear's snout, startling her. In a blur of muscle and fury, the bear charged. Zoltan stumbled under the impact as the heavy weight slammed into him, knocking him backward onto the ground with brutal force. The bear's claws slashed open his thigh and shoulder, deep, jagged wounds burning with sharp pain. His body hit the earth hard, the shock of the attack sending searing waves of agony through his muscles and bones. Blood gushed from the wounds, soaking into the grass and pooling beneath him. Despite the pain, Zoltan struggled to shield himself, his breaths ragged and shallow. His mind fought panic and confusion, adrenaline flooding his system even as weakness began to creep in. Marek and Jan reacted quickly, their faces pale but determined. They grabbed flares from their packs, striking them with trembling hands and hurling the bright, crackling lights toward the bear. The sudden bursts of fiery light startled the animal, forcing her to hesitate and shift her attention away from Zoltan. With a low, threatening growl, she retreated into the darkness of the forest, vanishing among the trees with the soft rustle of leaves and breaking twigs. The camp, once alive with reckless noise, fell suddenly silent. Only the crackle of the fire and the heavy breathing of the wounded man remained. Zoltan lay on the earth, his strength ebbing, but his will to survive burning fiercely. Marek and Jan wrapped torn pieces of their clothing around the wounds, applying pressure to slow the bleeding as best they could. The warm night air pressed close, but the cold seeped into their bones, mingling with the blood and fear. Without a phone signal and miles from the nearest village, the three friends faced a daunting reality. They lifted Zoltan carefully and carried him to the van, the journey along the rough gravel road agonizingly slow and jarring. Every bump and jolt sent fresh pain shooting through Zoltan's battered body. Darkness deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead like silent witnesses to the ordeal. At last, after hours of painful travel, they reached the village. Local emergency responders were summoned, and soon Zoltan was airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Bratislava. There, doctors performed complex surgery, to repair deep muscle damage and prevent infection from the bear's claws and teeth. His recovery was long and painful. Weeks of physical therapy followed as Zoltan fought to regain mobility and strength in his injured leg and shoulder. The scars on his skin and the memory of that night remained etched deeply within him. Wildlife officials later examined the site. Their report noted the bear's behavior as restrained, the attack ceasing the moment the threat diminished. The female had acted in defense of her cubs, her maternal instincts driving the sudden violence. Experts stressed that bears rarely attack unprovoked, and most incidents stemmed from humans encroaching on their territory or provoking them. The incident sparked a heated debate in the region. Calls for stricter camping regulations, improved public education on bear safety, and enhanced enforcement of food disposal rules resonated throughout local communities. The delicate balance between humans and wildlife was once again thrown into sharp relief. For Zoltan, the experience was a brutal reminder of the forest's power and unpredictability. The playful taunts and careless noise had summoned a force far older and wilder than his bravado. The king of the forest had answered. The wounds healed, but the lesson endured. Respect for nature's rules was the only shield against its fierce, ancient strength. October 3rd, 2008, in the high reaches of the Caucasus Mountains, where fog clings low and the air thins with every step, Anton Vlasov moved deeper into the limestone ridges alone. At 39, he had spent half his life in caves, surveying, mapping, and chasing the call of underground silence. A seasoned spelunker and geologist, he had come to this part of the range on a solo expedition, hoping to chart the rumored dead-end side chambers of a narrow cave system known locally as Kavri's Throat. Few dared go far into it. Locals said it was a cold, cramped vein in the mountain that led nowhere. Anton didn't believe in anything. By the third day, he was more than 100 meters below the surface, with only a helmet lamp, climbing gear, and a small pack of essentials. The air was still, the cold sharpening as he entered a passage he hadn't explored on previous trips. Its ceiling dipped lower with every meter, forcing him to crouch, then crawl, his hands numb through gloves as he pulled himself forward. He moved slowly, marking walls with chalk, his breath visible in the light. Then, in the dark ahead, something exhaled. It was not the wind. There was no draft, not air from a fissure or a settling echo. It was low, deep, and wet, a single breath. Anton froze, every muscle stiffening as instinct smothered thought. He held still in the silence that followed, heart pounding in his chest. Then his lamp caught the shape at the back of the narrow chamber, a bulk of dark fur curled tight against the wall, chest rising slowly and heavily. A brown bear, its form almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. It was asleep, or nearly so. Its breathing slow but uneven, one ear twitching, eyes not fully closed. Anton felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. There was no room to stand, no space to turn and sprint. Just a narrow body length of ground between him and the chamber's only exit. He began to crawl backward, inch by inch, every movement deliberate. His body trembled with the effort to remain silent, to shift his weight without disturbing the gravel or brushing against the walls. But the cave floor betrayed him. His boots slid against a patch of loose stone, and the sound was small, but it was enough. The bear stirred. Its breathing stopped for a heartbeat. Then it uncurled, head lifting. Eyes opened, dark and blank, locking onto the human shape caught in its cave. It didn't roar. It didn't hesitate. It surged forward in a single, violent lunge. Anton shoved himself backward into a narrow gap in the wall, barely the width of his shoulders. The rock scraped skin through his jacket. He twisted, wedging himself sideways as the bear slammed toward him. Its claws struck his thigh, tearing through muscle and fabric in one clean swipe. The pain exploded down his leg like fire, hot and nauseating. Blood poured immediately, soaking into the stone. The bear pressed against the crack, its snout inches from Anton's chest, breath steaming in the cold. It growled once, low and close, a rumble that vibrated through the stone, but then it stopped. After a long pause, it backed away into the chamber, disappearing from the light as slowly as it had come. Anton didn't move. He remained wedged in the crevice for hours, shaking, teeth chattering from cold and shock. Blood continued to seep from the wound on his leg, the warmth of it mixing with the cave's damp chill. Every few minutes he imagined the bear returning, saw its outline in the dark, and heard the breath again. But it never came back. 6 hours passed in near-complete stillness. At one point he tried to shift, but pain lanced through his body, nearly making him black out. He pressed his hand against the torn thigh to slow the bleeding, and focused only on breathing. His water was gone. His headlamp began to flicker. When he could no longer stand the cold or the silence, he forced himself to move. Crawling on one knee and one elbow, he inched back through the tunnel, dragging his shredded leg behind him. It was a slow, grueling escape. At times, the pain made his vision swim. At other times, he hallucinated movement behind him, convinced the bear was following, that it had waited and then changed its mind. By the time he reached the main passage, he had lost nearly all feeling in his foot. His leg looked mauled, deep claw marks running from hip to knee, muscle exposed in jagged lines. He climbed the last stretch to daylight with arms alone, crawling like an animal across stone slick with condensation. Outside the cave, the mountain air stung his skin, brighter and sharper than anything underground. He had no signal, no help. But he knew the terrain well enough to drag himself down the ridge, through brush and mud, until a shepherd's dog found him near the edge of a meadow. He was taken by horseback to a village clinic, then airlifted to a hospital. The surgeons saved the leg, though the nerves would never fully recover. He walked with a limp, long scars wrapped around his thigh like red vines. But he recovered. What haunted him wasn't the moment of the strike. It wasn't even the pain or the image of the bear's claws disappearing into his skin. It was the breath, that first low exhale from the dark, the silence afterward. Not the peace of untouched wilderness, but the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that meant something was already awake and aware, watching without fear, and choosing, for now, not to finish what it had started. He never returned to that cave. He never finished mapping the chamber. Some places, he would later say, aren't dead ends at all. They're warnings.